On behalf of all three of us, we would like to begin this presentation with both a land acknowledgement and a practice acknowledgement. Is shown in the next screen, Jeff. So we are, each of us, calling in from the land of a different Indigenous people. I'm calling in from the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag peoples, Lindsey from the Lenape peoples, and Jeff from the land of the Piscataway people. At the same time, we want to say that we acknowledge more than just geography. We acknowledge the knowledge and the wisdom of those Indigenous peoples in understanding that the arts and daily life are continuous. And it's in that spirit that we frame what we want to do today. So next one. In our time today, we have a big idea that we want to either share or remind you of. And that is that our artistic processes, that is the very ways in which we dance, fashion objects, sing, are in fact tools of inquiry, no matter where in the world or in what time or from what peoples. The making and the enacting of artistic practices has always been an inquiry into two fundamental questions. First, what is it, this life that we lead? And two, how do we make it meaningful? So today, building on that, we're going to look at three different cases in which the tools of the arts themselves are really used as ways of finding out. So I'll start by talking about that in the context of an ongoing evaluation. Lindsey will talk about the use of artistic practices in formal research, and Jeff will lead us out into the role of artistic practice in actual policy making. We want the session to be interactive, so we would be delighted if you stay with us for a moment of reflection after each one of us speaks, but then finally for a studio moment in which you take time to reflect on what this kind of approach could mean for your own practice, and hopefully, time allowing, share some of those ideas. So I wanted to start by talking about an ongoing evaluation project. It's a project with City Lore, an urban folklore center. It's the name of the project is Homer to Hip Hop, and it inquires into the role of spoken, performed, and written poetry in the lives of young people in Queens, probably one of the most diverse geographic regions in the country. It's shown in the next slide, Jeff. So, as I said, City Lore is an urban folklore center. It partners with the public schools of Queens. And at the center of this project is really a great, deep, and abiding respect for oral poetry traditions. Also, emphasis on young people both speaking and writing in all of the languages that they possess. And helping to make that possible is a core of culturally and linguistically diverse teaching artists who also operate in multiple languages. It's an intense project. There are 14-week residencies, both in the fall and the spring. And the oral poetry traditions that are investigated are deliberately global. So blues, hip hop, as well as traditional Persian ghazal forms, and many more. So the next one, Jeff, please. So we began trying to think about how best to capture what participation in this project might mean for young people. And we turn to many of the sort of standard, recognized and reliable quantitative measures like reading and writing test scores or promotion of young people to new levels of instruction in English as a new language. Also surveys of students, which ask them about their confidence in being writers, or teachers' judgments about those same kinds of matters. We also enrich that with qualitative measures, like a common prompt in which students wrote and then revised and then thought out loud about those revisions. So student interviews about how my poem works. We even experimented with young people having journals in which they recorded how much writing they did outside of the residency. But in the end, as we looked at the student samples of work, we were fundamentally disappointed. As much as those measures told us things that we could report to funders, to school departments and those kinds of things, they fundamentally failed to capture what was emerging as the heartbeat of the project. So if you consider a group of primary school students contributing to a huge oral poem called I Wish, what you saw in each child's turn was a remarkable poetic, but fundamentally metaphorical turn of thinking. So we set about asking, how would we capture the capacity that leads a third grader to say, I wish there was a green box of chocolate foxes? Next one, Jeff, please. So this led us to really thinking about how we do evaluation, and made us ask, first of all, what was it we really wanted to learn? So we wanted to think about poetry as a life tool, but also as a way of thinking or understanding your own creative process and your relationship to it. What activities, what artistic activities were really at the heart of that project, and how could we put them to work as tools of investigation? So asking questions like of young people like, why do you write a poem? How do you write a poem? And how is poetry a way of thinking? And yeah, so the other thing that emerged as we began to press forward on this kind of more open-ended evaluation was a kind of partnership with teaching artists as co-researchers. So for instance, this is an example of one of the, quotes, assessment tasks that one of the poet teachers, Sergio Jimenez, developed. Why write a poem? And in this task, he was asking every child to invent a kind of poem, one that had never existed before. He asked them to talk about its form, but even more important, he asked, when do people use it? What do they want their poems to do? So this gave us a way of asking children to talk about what they saw the power of poetry as being, which would have been much too abstract and heady a question to ask of second graders. So here's an example of the kinds of material that we're beginning to get. The Mexico firework pop can only be done during firework are going off when you write it. And go to sleep, you will dream about a man in a bright suit, and he will grant you 3 wishes that will come true. So as we're beginning to look through these kinds of responses, what we see emerging is that children are coming to understand the transformative power of poetry, and that poetry is not just pretty or decorative, but it represents a way in which people can actually act on and in the world. So next one, Jeff, please. So we also are starting to ask young children, what does it take to make a poem? And again, here, that's a possibly very abstract inquiry. So we tried to make it concrete by saying, you're an inventor, invent the perfect pen for writing poetry, one with all the features a writer needs to write really good poems. So here again is the kind of response this sort of inquiry is yielding. This pen has settings. When you set it on poetry, it writes in that specific way. Like it counts the syllables and decides how long the line should be and follows the rhyme like A, B, A, B. For that, you fill it with poetry ink. But it has another chamber you can fill. That's for the erasing fluid. You need that for changing mistakes, but also for cutting out all the extra words that get in the way of the meaning jumping out at you. So here we see that even as a second and a third grader, what we're beginning to find out is that young people have a very keen sense of how poems work, and not just in the formal A-B sense, but in the way that they're able to zoom in on the specificity and the amount of choice making that goes into writing a poem. So for them, what's emerging is that they are keenly aware that when you write poetry, you are choosing exactly what you want to say, and you are articulating a voice of your own in the world. So a third inquiry we started to take on is asking kids, what do poems do? So we're asking them to imagine a poem or a tool. What tool would it be, and what could it help a person to do? And this is a sixth grader, in this case, responding. An anvil. You can forge words and ideas on it. All the time you have these thoughts floating around in your head, sort of soft and messy and not real. When you put them into a poem, you have to forge them out. The hammer and the heat of it gets the shape you really want. You get more world-like ideas. So here what's beginning to emerge is young people's understanding not only of how a poem works, but why it's worth doing the work that's involved in poetry. So next one, Jeff. So we're, as a team of people at City Lore, really thinking about what these kinds of very different questions and measures tell us about rethinking evaluation. That they are ways of capturing the intrinsic value of the work of being a poet. That how important it is to collaborate with teaching artists. They absolutely know the work and can help researchers and evaluators to identify that heartbeat of the work. Never to underestimate what young people can do or tell or show. If you think about all of those three tools of inquiry, they're sophisticated, they're hard in some respects, but young people as early as second grade totally rise to the occasion. And we can use the information arising from this portion of the evaluation for very important purposes that we don't often think of as central to evaluation, but which in fact are. So they help us to clarify what's at stake, why we do this as human beings. And in that sense, they set a very high bar for the way we approach programs and their delivery. And thirdly, they evoke what's possible. They don't just measure it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsey.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Lindsey, and I am the Vice President of Education and Public Engagement at the New Victory Theater in New York City. Next, yeah. So the New Victory Theater is a theater for kids and families right on 42nd Street. And we have very deep education programs that go along with a large roster of shows that we share normally every year. And in a normal year, the shows that are on our stage are a mixture of all sorts of things. They come from all around the world. There's some circus, some puppetry, some theater. So they're cross genres, and they're for all age groups, all the way down to 2-year-olds and all the way up to shows that were created for grown-ups, but we think that teen audiences would really enjoy. And in a pre-pandemic year, we would have seen about 40,000 kids coming through our education performances and about 60,000 family members. And a lot of those young people who are coming through our education performances are also doing residencies and workshops. A few years back, we had the opportunity to start a brand new program that could really bring us really in depth into schools that had no previous arts partners. We named it SPARK, Schools with the Performing Arts Reach Kids. And who you don't see on this call is my wonderful partner at the New Victory Theater, Courtney J. Body. And she had this vision of starting this program at elementary schools and middle schools with no arts teachers and no previously established partnerships with arts organizations. And she said, what would happen if we brought those kids across the entire grade levels to the theater 3 times over the course of a year? What would happen if we did long-term residencies with our teaching artists and they did art making? And what would happen if we stuck with them sequentially for multiple years? And we continued to work with them. And so that's what we put together. And it gave us an amazing opportunity to also make some inquiries about how our work was actually being felt and how it impacted young people. So here's sort of the framework that we ended up with. We knew from our work that a lot of the work that we did in the classrooms with our teaching artists was really amazing at sparking imagination for young people. And we felt like that we thought the other thing that was happening is that it was helping young people have a broader understanding of the world itself and of their own place in it. But we didn't have any data or information around this. We also were pretty sure that there was some other socio-emotional outcomes that were happening. We knew from other research studies that empathy was increasing. We thought that our work was also impacting their ability to collaborate with each other. And so here's where the sort of sweet spot was for a research study. And the thing that was important to us is that we didn't want to just do this research study. We didn't want to measure something using really static measurement tools. So what we did is we brought in a group of teaching artists, a group of New Victory staff members, and some principal researchers from Wolf Brown. And we all sat in a room and sort of laid out a list of what was it that we were curious about? What did we think that our work did? What did we think that seeing live performance did? But we also worked with our teaching artists to identify what are the things we already did as parts of our residency program that we could use to mine for data. Things like the students were often put in the role of creating their own shows, planning it, casting it, creating it, writing the scripts. They were often asked to reflect on the shows that they saw, assigning meaning to characters' choices, extending stories. They were often asked to embody characters themselves. And so these all seemed like artistic activities that were ripe for using to explore the questions we had around what this work was doing for young people. But the thing that was key for us is because we were working with a group of teaching artists already, they were actually helping us craft those collection tools. So I'm not going to give you the overview of what it is we learned. We learned a lot. In fact, I have hundreds of graphs that if you would like to contact me, my contact information is on the last slide, and I'd love to talk more about it. Overall, I can tell you we learned that if you come and see live performing arts regularly and work with teaching artists, you are more likely to think that theater is something that is for you. You are more likely to think that you will do theater or see theater in the future. We also learned that it does impact their own ability to think creatively, the length of time that they have improvisations. We learned all these sorts of things. It also seems to impact how much hope they had for their own future, how positive they thought that that future would be. But let's drill down into some of the tools that we use to actually collect some of this data, because I think that's where the really interesting part for this conversation is. So here's one tool that Wolf Brown and the teaching artists and the New Victory staff worked to create. We knew that our residencies regularly were asking young people to be performers, designers, writers, directors, and that these were roles that were regularly being asked of the young people we worked with. And so what we decided to do is collect at the beginning and end of each year. So before they came and saw the productions and worked with the teaching artists, and then at the end, and then at the start of the next year, and at the end of the next year, who in their class they think would be good to collaborate with in these different roles. Write down everyone in this class that you think would be good at designing, that you'd like to collaborate with. Write down everyone in this class you think would be a good director that you would like to collaborate with. And we collected that data from both our treatment kids, the kids that were in the Spark program, and the grade above them that was not getting to come and see shows or work with teaching artists. And we collected this data over multiple years. And here's what we found. So after year one, there was definitely a difference in how many people the students were identifying that they would collaborate with. The growth of that year was much higher for the kids in the program than for the kids not in the program. But the other thing we learned is that after 2 years, we had, instead of a growth, we had what we learned is called a buffering effect. So young people who were not taking part in coming to the theater and working with teaching artists were actually declining in how many of their peers they said they would collaborate with, while the young people who were taking part with us working in theater basically stayed steady. They didn't lose the ability to collaborate because they were working with us, while their peers were actually declining if they weren't taking part in these same activities. So this was one way that we collected data, by using the actual regular artistic work that we were doing in our residency. But we did some other ones as well. So here's another example. This is a still shot of a video. And what we did is we pulled out a couple of select kids from the young people who were taking part in the Spark program, and a couple of select kids who were not taking part in the Spark program, who were the year above. And we asked them to do this performance task multiple times, once at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year for multiple years. And what we were looking at is, okay, we sat the kid down. We had them look at this short video of this mime exploring their surroundings. We paused the video and had the young person identify emotions or things that that character might be thinking and feeling, right? These are already activities that we regularly do in our own work. Then we paused the video and we said, okay, get up and show us what happens next. And then we asked them to sit back down and narrate from the very beginning to the end, everything that happened in the story, as if they were like a narrator on a radio show. And our teaching artists were actually the ones who had helped us design this task. And what they did is they really helped us identify and think about, what do students need that we can standardize to be able to do this task successfully and show growth. So our teaching artists helped us standardize a warm-up that the young people were asked to do. They helped us standardize how did we arrange the room so that every student who was asked to do this task approached a similar setting in the room. So we could look at this, so we could observe them and actually collect how they were behaving, what the narration was, how they were performing, and use it as data to compare. The other thing that we sort of did is we looked at this information for a variety of inquiry questions that we had. And on the next slide, you'll see sort of an example of how we broke it down. So we were looking for a couple of different things. So from the narration, we then took that, we had an audio recording of it, and then we'd had people listen to it to code it. So they were looking for things like life outside the frame. How much were these young people imagining a world that they were not shown in the video? Causes and consequences. How much were these young people identifying this is what happened and this is what happened after and because of that? So we were listening for all these different outcomes that we were curious about, we thought might be happening. Next slide. We also looked for change over time. So this is an actual example of one student from the fall of 2015 to the spring of 2018, so about 3 years. And the difference in how this young person sort of explained this moment from this video. And we were really looking for the students overall that were performing this task, what was changing for them over time. And we also had a question of, was that change over time just because they were growing older, or was it because of the work that they were doing, seeing live performance and working with teaching artists? And what we learned is that it really was, seemed to be attaching to the program itself. So this is one just tiny graph that I wanted to share with you. That solid line going straight up are the program participants, the treatment group that were coming to see the live performance, and they were also working with our teaching artists. And that line that again is going just a little bit down are a couple of control students that were doing these same tasks over time. And this is an example of seeing the difference. This one was specifically how many words or how often were they talking about a life outside of the frame, imagining something that was happening outside of the video that they were watching. And this kind of work was so exciting to us because it helped us understand, by using the very tools that we were doing regularly, it helped us understand what the program was doing. And we could not have done this without being in conversation with a set of teaching artists, staff, and researchers ourselves. So this was just a few examples of some of the work that we've done. I'm happy to share more later, but this was the work that we did as part of the Spark program at the New Victory Theater. And are we pausing for questions now, Dennie, or do you want to keep going into Jeff?
I passed over mine because I had run too long. So, but let's take a pause for this.
Take a pause. So if anyone does have questions, either about Dennie's work with City Law or Dennie's work with the New Victory, you can definitely toss a question or a comment into the chat. And then we'll hear our final piece from Jeff. We might be able to move forward.
Yeah, I think people are thinking.
At the end, we'll be back to do a little bit of time to reflect more on how this might impact your own work.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Lindsey and Dennie, for your presentations. My name is Jeff Poulin with Creative Generation, and it is my pleasure to be sharing with you some of our work that was conducted in partnership with Art Place America in the year 2020. The Creative Youth and Community Development Research Initiative was the 10th and final exploration of Art Place America, looking specifically at the role of young people or youth in community development using their arts and cultural education. It was originally devised pre-pandemic. However, it was implemented in the midst of the pandemic and utilized arts-based research initiatives led by young people to investigate the impact of their projects on public policy in their own communities. Art Place America, by way of just a short introduction, was a 10-year, $10 million initiative through a coalition of funders that investigated these numerous areas of community life in dark blue, such as agriculture or health, housing, public safety, transportation, and so forth, across a number of sectors like civic, social, and faith, commercial, governmental, nonprofit, philanthropy, and so forth. The 10th and final sector was that of youth development, due to the belief that they really thought young people were embedded in all of these other dark blue sectors. and that youth development or youth engagement cross-sectorally could actually drive a number of different provisions for arts and culture. So what we started by recognizing was that there are certain universal truths. So we thought from the literature, from our lived experiences, and from other work in this space that truly imagined young people as essential members of communities, that recognized that community programs support the creative development of young people, that we know young people use their creativity to drive community change, and that how we, as the educators, teaching artists, community nonprofits, and social service sector, describe our work, evaluate our work, and measure our success actually changes how we implement our work. So what we wanted to know was, what is the impact of creative youth on their communities? And we began by identifying 134 programs nationwide that were engaged in this type of youth-led community development work through arts education programs, and chose 9. These 9 were an interesting matrix. They were representative of the nation, of the cross sectors that we examined with ArtPlace, and were still functioning and in touch with young people throughout the pandemic. They ranged from One Hood Media's Artivist Academy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Arts Amplify Youth, a youth-led health summit in San Diego, California, to the reservation of the Lakota people in South Dakota. What we found was that ultimately young people identified their creative work as having impact on multiple sectors, but not just that they were multiple in nature, but that they were interconnected. Our first activity with young people, these young artists that led community-based projects, was to illustrate the web that they described. And here's an example of what we saw when putting together the 9 webs that were created after they conducted interviews and other types of data collection in their communities. You see here food and agriculture connect to environment, or immigration and education reform. All of it's often grounded in racial justice, justice reform, and community leadership. But ultimately, what we saw was an intertwining of silos that were prevalent in the preceding research in community development. These young artists were able to tactfully demonstrate through their written, spoken, visualized, or movement to talk about that intertwining nature. So we asked them to actually map it out, creating maps with their bodies in shared space on film, with their visual media through digital or hand-drawn. And what we saw in a conversation between 2 teaching artists and 2 young people from programs was this model, which first demonstrates the realms of impact being between individual young creatives as well as adult artists, demonstrating this co-creative process of arts learning. And immediately after that, they mapped the personal impact to their friends or families and caregivers, artists, activists, and other mentors that participated in their process, which spurred a second realm of impact to the community, thinking about those arts and cultural education programs, other cultural organizations, their broader schools, or youth-serving organizations. And ultimately, these 2 examples activated their artistic projects developed in their arts education program to impact institutions of higher education, the general public, governmental agencies, or community leaders. In this conversation, which was later anonymized and seen here, we were able to see this resonating realm out from the original creative process to personal, community, and public. When we shared this with the other 7 participants, we asked them to respond in whatever creative way they saw fit. And they did, demonstrating the numerous types of impacts that occurred. Once we coded and categorized these, whether they were written in poem, rap, shared in an interview, or written on the page, we found a huge similarity to some pretty transformational thinking in the space of arts impacts from the early 2000s from the publication Gifts of the Muse. These young people, through their own artistic practices and ideas, outlined the differentiation between intrinsic or instrumental impact, things that really made them feel good, that they enjoyed doing, or that impacted others in numerous ways that could be demonstrated across sectors. They also articulated the private versus the public impact, the impacts that happened to them individually or that happened to their groups, their communities, families, and stakeholders. But what they actually did was they extended this to a third, a Z-axis, a community axis, they called it, that ranges between people impact and place. When working in their communities, oftentimes their intent in their artistic process was to change the physical environment, the spaces and places they occupied. Similarly, they wanted to change the people who they were in community with. This community-based axis extends the way that we, as arts and cultural educators, move forward with the way that we design our projects with young people. No longer just bound to the axis of outcomes, instrumental or intrinsic, or experiences being private or public, we now can think about the transformative nature of arts learning experiences and the cultural products of young people on the people in their communities and the places within their communities. Finally, we coded all of the different artifacts, be they dance, visual art, performance, or music, and found a number of different long-term impacts that were consistent across our samples. This is how young people talked about the long-lasting impacts of their creative projects in their youth development arts-based programs, nourishing creativity and cultivating agency, nurturing sustainable and responsive communities, building strong and interpersonal and collective bonds, fostering health, well-being, and belonging, catalyzing intergenerational cultural continuity. That was a new one for me. Enabling access to welcoming, safe, and healthy spaces, rethinking community, civic, and cultural institutions, and developing systems of collective decision-making. Now, these exact terms didn't appear in any one response, poem, song, or so forth, but those action verbs, they all did. And that's pretty outstanding for me, to be able to give us a new vocabulary, an arts-based vocabulary for discussing the impacts of creative youth development programs. One thing to note was that this graph was drawn by a dancer named Akila in New Orleans, Louisiana. She's part of a program called Dancing Grounds, Dance for Social Change. They specifically looked at how they could impact the negative outcomes of gentrification and displacement in their communities. They put on a site-specific dance festival with 3 stages and ended up changing the public policies about redlining and other housing codes in their city through their dance education program. But specifically, what Akila talked about was that she could have created dances and presented them to people in her world alone and would have had a certain amount of impact. She also reflected that she could have done it together with her mentor, dance educator, Coach Jess, and that would have had some more impact. But what she chose and what their dance education program did was brought forth their efforts in community, not meaning in the physical space of community, but in sharing a community of adults and young people, dancers and other community members to increase their impact exponentially over time. And she drew this graph. It was just on a scrap piece of paper, so we've recreated it here. And again, this talks about how we can shift those long-term impacts over time by creating intergenerational spaces where that cyclical co-creation of artistic product happens through an arts education process. So finally, what I'd like to show you is a piece of documentation. This is a clip that incorporates bits of creative pieces that were generated throughout our research process from these young people, these young creative leaders in their communities, and put forward by a youth documentarian team from the Loop Lab in Boston, Massachusetts. What they did is they took the voices, the stories, and some of the creative pieces that were shared to create these graphs that you saw in my presentation and brought them to life on video. You'll see some dancers swirling and moving around in concentric circles. That's the graph about realms of impact. You'll see lines in diagonal and adding a third dimension. That is the dimensions of impact. You'll hear the words of spoken word poet, Treble NLS, speaking about Black Lives Matter, which again resonates through those long-term impacts around building community, intergenerational relationships, and creating safe and welcoming spaces. So here, I'm going to play this video. It's just about 1 minute, and I challenge you to look for those bits of evidence that we found in their creative practice.
To describe the program, it's a place where like youth and like not just youth, the teachers can come together and learn from each other.
This program truly values the voices of young people. It's not censored. We're taking what they're saying, their thoughts, their voices.
If we want to see us as a collective growing stronger by the day, we have to see ourselves as individuals grow stronger every day.
The team very adamant about like pausing the work to lean into like the relationships that are in the space.
With that creative expression, I think what we would see is happier people, happier communities.
So now I'll turn it back over to my colleagues to walk us through an activity to think about some of our own work. Lindsey, over to you.
Thank you. All right. So here is another way. You've seen this graph before. And here's another way to think about your own work. So we used the New Victory as an example. What are you curious to learn in your own program organization? And for us, the answer was, we were curious to learn about whether the young people grew in their ability to do ensemble work, whether they were understanding and interacting with others in a different way. But what we'd like to do now is take 30 seconds. And this applies whether you're here live with us right this second, or if you are watching this at some point in the future, we invite you to do this as well. If you could take 30 seconds and think about a specific program or organization that you're working with and think, what are you curious to learn about the work that you are doing there? As you are thinking about it, if you are live with us right now, if you would be willing to share some of your curiosities in the chat, we'd love to be able to have those populate the space as well. The next piece of what we'd like you to think about is what artistic activities do you already do inside that program or that organization? What is the regular work that your young people or your participants are taking part in that is artistic in nature? So I'll give you about another 30 seconds. And again, if you are joining us live and would be willing to share any of that in the chat, we'd love to populate the space with your ideas. And finally, and this is the part that we think is rich and ripe for a discussion, is how can you imagine using those arts activities to investigate what you wanted to learn about? So for the New Victory as the example, we were curious about how it helped young people, how seeing live performing arts helped people understand the lives of others. And we knew that we often asked them to take on, the thoughts of other characters or write out scripts. And so for us, we decided to use that sort of narration and investigation of a character's inner thoughts and life. And we applied that to our arts assessment, right? That video of the mind. We asked young people to assign thoughts and feelings. We asked them to create a narration and a script of what was happening. So we used that art activity to investigate one of the things we were curious about. And we would love to know, in your brain, can you imagine any of the art activities that you currently use that might be able to be crafted to investigate the things you're curious about? And Dennie also has a note in the chat that not only should you be thinking about which arts activities you are already using, how you can use that to investigate, but we'd also invite you to think about who is helping you design these kind of assessments. Do you have artists in the room? Do you have the program administrators? Do you have the staff of the schools you're working in? Do you have the young people themselves? Instead of thinking of creating a research assessment as a completely sort of solitary and removed activity, how could we be better thinking about creating these kind of research assessments, these artistic research assessments, in collaboration and in community with the artists and the people that we are serving? Dennie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Both yesterday and earlier today in discussions, I think an issue opening wide up in what's on people's minds is that of who's at the table, who gets to design, who gets to decide, who gets to code, who gets to report. And I think this is an excellent example of that.
Is there anyone live in the session today that is thinking a thought, a rough draft of a thought that maybe wants to share what they're thinking? I don't mean to put you people on the spot, but you are here. I see no hands, Dennie. Do you want to talk us through sort of how this has changed for you over time?
Yeah. Well, the one other thing that listening to you and Jeff has really made me think about is how we need to think about evidence, whether it's from assessments or from program evaluations, in a much more generous way. So yes, it's important to have the kinds of evidence that, for instance, you put on the table, Lindsey, but also the kinds of evocative evidence of the kind that Jeff put on the table, or I tried to put on the table. So I think another big question for people who are thinking about the principles of assessment in the arts is to really open up the question of, how do we know, and what different kinds of knowledge are we willing to engage with? So I don't know, hearing nothing from anybody else. What about you, Jeff? What's it put on your mind?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in, Dennie. You know what?
Oh, here's one.
So in the chat,
Yeah.
Dr. Anne Renee Joseph has written, the graphic is powerful, as are the questions, unique to every student as to what they know, what they want to know, and how they imagine finding out what they want to know and learn.
I'm happy to jump in and just share an anecdote from our project. So one of the case studies that we worked with was performing statistics in Richmond, Virginia. And one of the young people that we primarily worked with, his name was Sid. And Sid was a formerly incarcerated young person who used his visual art, storytelling, poetry, and performance to advocate against youth prisons and for the abolishment of the juvenile justice system. And what was interesting is when we provided Sid with a research protocol to talk to others in his neighborhood about the impacts of the creative work of performing statistics, he basically said that protocol sounded like parole, which he was already on, and he had no interest in engaging in that. And so what he wanted to do was make raps with young people in his neighborhood. And that would end up being the artifacts that we collected to code and analyze and determine what their perceptions of the impact of his creative work was. And what was interesting is that all of the items that we as researchers and evaluators and others think of as sort of the process we follow is actually inherent in young creatives. But the words that we use to describe it, or the process that we outline in black and white words on a page, is foreign. And so what we found through that is that we just needed to prompt things by truly speaking about collecting the stories or asking the questions in order to illuminate it. And they would inherently use their artistic practices that they're engaged with to elevate those ideas. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me that sort of made me want to go burn my degrees from universities, because they, didn't necessarily do me a favor in this sense. And I just want to share that because Sid has stuck with me anytime that I design any study now.
Yeah, and what you say, Jeff, sparks for me the fact that most of our research, evaluation, and assessment paradigms call upon us to know ahead of time what we will see and what will count as a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. But in your spirit of anecdote, I was interviewing a young writer in San Diego and shared with him the rubric for that task. It was writing his city council members about immigration reform. And he pushed the rubric to one side, just like in a way Sid did. And he asked me, he said to me, why do adults think they know ahead of time what young people can do? You're ruling out, or what do you say? Don't you ever want to be surprised? So, I mean, I think part of what comes out of these 3 examples for me is how do we build assessment systems that are on the one hand clear and rigorous, but on the other hand allow for surprise. Oh, and I see Paul. Hello, Paul from Rhode Island School of Design. How nice to see you here. Paul is asking, I'm curious about how young people's participation in our program may be a very considered decision to craft a pathway for a future creative life. So Paul, do you want to unmute yourself, or Jeff, do you want to unmute Paul to hear some more about that?
Hi, Dennie.
Hello,
Thank you for the opportunity. As you know, we run a college access program at RISD called Project Open Door, and I'm always curious about really why teens apply to the program, but many are thinking about their futures, and I'm sort of really curious about the decision to join the program and their future aspirations. So this is beyond the quality of the work itself. It's, they come in with certain ideas, they're thinking about certain colleges, but it's leading to a future. So I'm very interested in their future lives and how they're connecting these experiences to their future lives. And by future lives, I mean beyond work or beyond college, beyond high school, beyond college, and later on.
Yeah, having sat in studios at Open Door, I know what beautiful drawings and illustrations your students make. And I wonder whether literally drawing on those skills,
Right.
you might ask them to portray where they are now, where they might be in the future, both at the beginning of their participation in Open Door and later, because I think that would be a beautiful example of using the materials, the practices, the strategies you and they have at hand. To portray that.
I certainly think that that would be interesting, particularly as with many of these teens, we're with them for 4 years.
Yeah.
And actually going on not only to the 4 years they're with us, but the time that they're actually alums at college or university. And so I was really struck by how the creative prompts that were described in the first 2 case studies that were that how they revealed young people's deep understanding of the artistic form. So I think the challenge, and I think the opportunity that I have after this presentation, is to think with my colleagues about the crafting of the creative prompt, creative artistic prompt.
I also wonder whether there's a possibility you have alumni that you would invite into that brainstorming room, that the alumni themselves who are already in their future might have some really interesting ways to think about crafting that prompt itself.
Yeah, I'm currently on sabbatical, and this is where my curiosity is leading me, because I think I'm looking at students both in the program at the moment, those that are at college or university, and those that are actually working. So I think, to sort of connect those dots would be really intriguing. And
also to ask them to capture what didn't work, where the process became endangered or broke, or they had to return to it. Because I think we can't just presume that it's smooth as glass.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you online throughout the rest of the summit.
Thanks for everybody coming.